everybody to join. I was hoping that those of you who are on the webinar could grab a piece of paper and a pencil or something to write with and either draw a couple of images or write some notes of a situation, a scenario, an experience you had in nature that was important or meaningful to you. And I put some inspiration images down below. It could be absolutely anything, anywhere outside. But because I live in the city, I pulled some kind of, that's actually usually how I think of nature, is more kind of urban nature, but maybe it was on a farm far away from an urban area, whatever is meaningful to you. And then maybe you could share some ideas in the chat as well, just to give us a little description of what you're thinking about.
I've been doing a lot of pigeon watching, baby pigeons.
Yeah, exactly. They're so interesting. Yeah.
Fascinating. Who'd have thunk? And also squirrels. We have some very acrobatic squirrels in our backyard.
Our neighbors put up a new bird feeder while we've all been home, and my cats are very excited about that. So it's really fun to watch the interaction between the cats inside looking out and the birds outside looking in, knowing that they're safe.
Like Netflix for cats.
Exactly. Yep.
So we already have some pigeon commentary. Someone is afraid of pigeons. I love pigeons personally. They're one of my favorite animals. People always think that that's weird, but I grew up in the city and they were kind of like the primary source of wildlife.
Yeah.
And I fell in love with pigeons also one time when they get on the train. Have you ever been on on the MBTA and the pigeon gets on? And the thing that I love about pigeons is that they seem unfazed oftentimes.
Yeah.
When they get on, it's almost like they were just planning it, like they were just getting off 2 stops later. That's what I love about pigeons. Yeah. But I do understand the fear of pigeons.
Especially when there are a lot of pigeons, like when they're all, well, kind of like the picture there, when there's a lot of them all together, it can be a little overwhelming, I think.
Can be.
But yeah, I think pigeons, they're hard to phase. They've seen a lot of things.
They have. But seagulls terrify me in the same way that I think our participant is afraid of pigeons.
Yeah, seagulls are even bigger.
They are bigger. However, we were in Montreal last summer, and we noticed the seagulls are smaller there. And they seem a little bit.
I wonder if it's a different kind than what we have here.
Yeah, we noticed they were smaller. They seemed a bit more dignified. we guessed that they probably spoke French.
Yeah, I would assume.
Someone also said that they've seen a rabbit hanging out in their yard yesterday eating grass.
Oh, cool.
I've noticed more rabbits lately too. So pigeon phobia is real. Our participants.
Any non-animal related nature things that people are mentioning? Just out of curiosity.
Nothing yet.
Okay.
What do you guys think? Anything not an animal? So flora, right? So fauna is animals, right? And flora is everything else. We actually took away our bird feeders in our yard because we planted seeds and we were afraid they were going to eat our seeds. And we started watching the string bean sprouts in the same way that we were watching birds before, and we thought maybe string beans are the new birds.
Yeah.
That is dynamic, though. So interesting types of birds. So noticing a goldfinch.
Oh, cool.
I've noticed cardinals and blue jays, a lot of them. And also the grackles, the ones that look like kind of like baby crows.
You think, should we give folks a couple more minutes to jot down notes or draw a picture for us, or do you think we should get started?
What time is it right now? Yeah, I think maybe just give people a few more minutes to join us and to think about today's warm-up activity. So thinking about nature, you could draw a sketch, but Melissa from the Children's Museum, who's going to be our first presenter today, is asking us to think about an experience that you've had in nature that was memorable.
And then if you share some notes in the Q&A just about what you're thinking about, that would be interesting to me.
Me too. Right, so we're seeing hikes in the woods.
Mm-hmm.
I think anytime I've taken a hike in the woods, it's been a very memorable experience, and even more so now, appreciating nature when we can. Someone suggested that I glue feathers to the string beans and then they would be more like birds. So interesting. Someone again is asking about Tinkercad t-shirts. I have given out quite a few Tinkercad t-shirts to Boston Public Schools students. And I do actually have a nice box of more that I was planning to give out, but I do not have access to that box right now. Maybe in the future. People are saying that being outside helps me relax when I'm stressed, which I can relate with too. Like I feel very, I mean, we're in the city, but I feel very privileged that we actually have a private backyard that we can go out to. And I oftentimes do work from home anyways, but I found myself more and more going out into the yard during the day to take a break.
Yeah.
And then we have someone who I think is in Canada who's making me feel jealous. That he says he likes walking in the boreal forest and experiencing all of the smells and colors and textures on the trail, particularly moss and mushrooms. We are growing moss in our backyard right now, and I'm really excited about it. Mushrooms are also so interesting. And also in thinking about, so we were talking about how tomorrow, with the design thinking for Tinkercad session that I'm going to be leading with the United Way, we are going to be discussing how sometimes architects and designers think about nature as a design partner. And I think that Melissa plans to discuss that too. So bike rides at the very top of Lake Superior. That's when that nice walk was with the mushrooms. Yeah, and we're going to talk about biomimicry tomorrow.
Cool.
So that is the comments that we have so far. Melissa, it might be around a good time to say hi and get started.
Sure. Yeah, that sounds perfect. Thanks for sharing everything you guys have already shared. So I'm Melissa. I'm the Senior Director of STEAM at Boston Children's Museum, and I'm here today to talk a little bit about why the museum is thinking about designing for resilience and how hopefully that might inspire you to bring some of the same types of thinking into some awesome models that you could create. And we'll talk about that possibility for that project at the end of my slideshow here. I cannot see the Q&A list, but Kellyanne, who was just talking, is gonna help me out and let me know if you guys have questions that you put in there. So feel free to pop them in whenever they come into your head. We don't have to wait till the end necessarily. And then after my presentation, you're going to hear from some other folks from Thompson Island who have another possible challenge for you. So you'll get 2 challenges out of this webinar that you could engage with. So hopefully that will be fun. So this is Boston Children's Museum. And I think that you guys have the ability to do a raised hand to answer questions. And I was wondering if you guys could raise your hand if you have been to the museum before, and then maybe Kellyanne could give me a sense for, is it like half of you have been to the museum, hardly any of you, just so I can get a feel.
So the ticker is going up right now, Melissa. So about half of participants right now are saying that they've been to the museum.
Okay, that's exciting. We always love to hear when people have been to the museum. And a lot of people know us because of not the museum building itself, but that you can see this giant milk bottle that's over on the right here. That's another structure that's sort of on our front yard, and a lot of people know the museum because of that building. It's pretty iconic. But the museum is located in downtown Boston. We're kind of near Downtown Crossing. And one of the interesting things about our museum that you can also see in this picture is that we are right on the water. So if you look down to the bottom edge of that photo, you can see that there's a boardwalk out front, and there's water actually under that boardwalk. So I'm here today to talk about designing for resilience and why that's an important concept for our museum. But that word resilience, we probably think about in lots of different ways. I'm wondering if you can write in the Q&A box if there's another term or a description of the word resilience that comes to mind for you when I say resilience. What do you think?
So I'm seeing perseverance, the ability to bounce back, fighting, strength.
Yeah. Yeah, those are all really good terms. I had also thought about kind of overcoming difficulties and bouncing back. Yeah, so very similar qualities. And I think often when we're thinking about resilience, like in every day when we're talking to someone, sometimes we talk about that in terms of a personality trait for humans, and maybe resilience is especially important now when we're going through some tough times, but resilience also has a meaning for the environment. An environment can be resilient, and that's really what I'm going to focus on today, but hopefully there are some similarities between how we'll talk about it with the environment and how you might think about it in terms of like a personality characteristic. It's kind of fun to draw a connection there.
So someone made an allusion, oh Melissa, sorry to interrupt you, but someone made an allusion to ancient mythology and also a bird, the phoenix. So being able to bounce back and rise up like a phoenix. Nice simile there.
Yeah, that's very cool. That's a good idea. And I had not even thought of that kind of connection. So good ideas all around. So in this picture, you can see, like I said, we're right on the water, and we have a boardwalk in front of the building there. I think I have one other picture that gives you a different view. So this is kind of a bird's eye view. So, you know, the whole museum, and in fact, a lot of the neighborhood that we're located in is right on the water. And underneath that boardwalk that you see, there's a lot of fill or landfill that's under our building. And so this was, you know, this whole area right here and the boardwalk and the fill under it was created by people. We constructed this. And at the time when the building was put there, people weren't necessarily really thinking about the impact that the building would have on the land and some changes that could occur, including things like sea level rising and the water in front of the museum coming up pretty high nowadays. So people just weren't thinking about that, and they weren't thinking about the fact that the museum and this land would need to bounce back from really big storms and things like floods. So the lack of resilience here is what is a big problem for us now. So I'll talk a little bit about the specific site here at the museum in a minute, but I did want to kind of just point out, and some of you may be more familiar with Boston than others. I know there are people on the webinar from lots of different places, but Boston is a city that's right on the water, and almost every neighborhood is impacted by the water in some way. So we've got, for those of you who are from Boston, we've got neighborhoods like East Boston and Charlestown and Dorchester, and those are located on the harbor. And then there are other neighborhoods like Alston and Brighton and Mattapan. Those neighborhoods have rivers that run through them. And so for almost every neighborhood in Boston, we're living on the water, and that's something that we need to be, it's a real benefit, I think it's amazing, but it's also something that we need to be very aware of, because some of the things that we've done in terms of construction in the past haven't always been the most friendly to the environment and might cause some issues for us. So that's what we're going to talk about today. So like I said, here's the museum. We're right near Downtown Crossing. And again, you can see that red spot, which unfortunately I took this off Google Maps recently. So the museum is closed right now, of course, but that red dot there is where the museum is located, and you can see the channel that we're on there, and then the whole neighborhood is really surrounded by water. So it's a very real thing for us in the museum that we're surrounded by water. So here is an example of the issues that we can sometimes face right in this area. So the picture on the right with the bridge, you're looking under a bridge here, and normally that's actually how I walk to work. It's right out in front of the museum. So when I get to work, I usually cross that path, which is flooded now. So that's the boardwalk that's in front of the museum. And that picture is from 2016. And that was during a really high tide, which is called the king tide. And then the picture on the left, that's a building in the corner there. That's actually the museum's loading dock area. And that was in 2018 during a nor'easter that some of you might remember. It was a pretty epic storm. I know it's still in my memory. There was a lot of flooding and bad things going on in the city. So this is the very real reality that we face in this location right now. So, you know, on a normal day, the museum surrounded by water. This is actually an image that I took from the city of Boston. Has some nice modeling software that anybody can use to look at different scenarios. So the navy is the water around the museum. So that's on a normal day. And you can do some modeling. They've input all the information about what we know about how high above the water this land in this neighborhood is right now. And then you can see what can happen in different scenarios. So I pulled a couple of them for you to take a look at. So the first one, this is what a high tide might look like in this area in 2030. So 10 years from now, if there was a high tide, and if we left everything as is, you can see there's like some areas right on the edge that start to get some flooding during a high tide. And then this example is, again, if we did nothing in 2050, if there were high tides, what that might look like. And the reason there's, you know, it's going up a little bit more flooding each time is because if we do nothing, sea levels would continue to rise. So the high tide becomes higher because the whole sea level is higher in general. And then this one is if we did nothing, what it might be like in 2070 during a high tide. So you can see, I mean, right now, the museum is definitely underwater in this picture. A lot of the neighborhood is underwater. So, you know, that's pretty serious, and a good reason why we know we need to do something. And you can use the modeling software in other places as well. So here's Dorchester, right on Boston Harbor. This is kind of the part on the right that sticks out there is the neighborhood where the Dever School and the McCormick are located, for anybody who might know that area. And this one is, this would be 2070 with a high tide in that area if we didn't do anything at all and just left everything the way it is. And then a different part of Dorchester here, the Neponset River. This one, the blue areas would show in 2050, if there was a big storm and we did nothing, that the Neponset would overflow its banks, and then there would be some flooding, as we can see on the map here. One more neighborhood, East Boston, which is right on the harbor. So if there was a high tide in 2030 with no action, you can see there's a little bit of blue again around the edges. And then this one would be 2050, so a lot more of the neighborhood underwater. And much like the neighborhood the museum is in, we know that there have been some bad storms. So this is the Umana Academy in East Boston, and they've had some issues with flooding. This may actually have been the same storm that caused that big flood by the museum, by the loading dock there. So, you know, why do I share all these pictures with you and talk about all this flooding that could happen in the city? Really, it's because it's an issue, this issue impacts almost all of Boston, so it's really important for us to think about. Certainly for people who live in the city or anybody else who's living near the water in other places. But the other thing is that I really think that everybody who's on this webinar can do things in their own lives to help us solve this problem. So you probably noticed that I kept saying, if we do nothing, this is what would happen. And I actually don't believe that we're going to do nothing. I think that, you know, the museum is starting to think about this. I believe everybody who's on the webinar can start to help us with these problems too. So it's good to be aware of what would happen, but I really think that together we're going to solve this problem. And that is one opportunity that you're going to have at the end of this webinar for one of the challenges that we're going to offer you to help us think about this stuff. So for the museum, especially because we're a children's museum and we work a lot with kids and families from Boston and from other places too, we came up with 3 guiding principles for thinking about our work with resilience. And we're hoping that we're going to adapt and kind of lead our community in thinking about designing a resilient waterfront, activating the waterfront, which means that we would have some awesome places and stuff for families and kids to do right on the water. And then families and kids are our main audience, so it's really important to us that they would have a voice in what we're thinking about. So I'll talk a little bit more about specific plans for the museum and kind of how we're approaching it, but maybe I'll just pause, Kellyanne, to see if any questions have come up that you think I should pop in with the answers now. Otherwise, I'm happy to keep talking and we could do questions more later on.
Someone asked about, particularly about the picture when you showed the walkway of where you typically walk when it's not flooded, and they asked, how does it flood often?
How often does it flood?
Yeah.
That's a good question. Right now, it doesn't flood too often. I would say maybe in the past year, there's been flooding there maybe 5 times. So I guess, you know, it's funny to think, is that often or is that not often? Because having your walkway to work flood maybe does feel like, you know, many people could go their whole lives and never have their walkway to work flooded, I guess. But because, you know, we are right on the water, most days it's fine. But if there's a big high tide or a big storm, it does flood. And sometimes when I'm walking to work, I'll see that there's a lot of seaweed that's been washed up on the boardwalk, which is another good indicator that while there's no water there right now, maybe overnight, you know, some water was able to push the seaweed onto the boardwalk. So.
Have you noticed, like, I know, for example, like Symphony, the T station, like even when I was growing up, that used to flood a lot. Is the flooding, is it happening more often now, or do you know anything about the history of the flooding?
That is a good question. I don't know that data for sure. I would imagine that it is, and I bet you there's a good record on one of the City of Boston websites that I could probably pull, because that would be really interesting for us to know at the museum as well as to share back with folks. So, yeah.
And then just another question that I think that you're going to address later is where can I find the recordings of these presentations? So yes, these are being recorded, and Melissa's going to share with you where you can find it.
Yeah, my last slide has the link where you can go see the recordings from the past few days, and then this one will go up later today.
And we do have an authority who is one of our previous presenters who is saying, Polly's saying it is happening more often because of more severe storms, increased rainfall in a shorter period of time.
Thank you.
And I just want to
go
one participant who just was answering the prompt from earlier about she drew a picture of feeding giraffes because that was super important to her, and I just wanted to say that I had that experience too. The Franklin Park Zoo, you can sometimes feed giraffes, and it's pretty awesome.
Very cool.
All right, so I think that's it for now.
Okay, cool. Well, keep the questions coming if anything comes up. Okay, so these are the guiding principles for us at the museum as we're thinking about what our waterfront might look like. And so the other piece that's really important to us that I think was brought up in a couple of the other webinars, or at least one of maybe the webinar yesterday, is this aspect of environmental justice and resilience together. So we want our waterfront to literally be resilient in that we want it to bounce back, certainly bounce back in a better way than what we have currently. And the environmental justice piece of thinking about this work is that I pulled this this description right from the EPA website because I actually think it's pretty comprehensive and really gets at all the parts that are important here. But the environmental justice basically means that there is meaningful involvement of all the people who might be impacted by what's going on in the environment and the laws and regulations and policies that are getting put in place around this. So I especially like the bullet points that they shared about what this could look like. So, you know, people who, so in a neighborhood, for example, people who live in that neighborhood have the chance to weigh in on decisions and give their opinions and share what they know and really be heard by the people who are trying to make decisions that are going to impact that neighborhood. And that piece, well, the involvement of seeking out the involvement of those people is one really important piece, and then truly listening to what the people have to say is the other really important piece. So it's one thing, you know, if I was working to try and do some environmental work in a neighborhood, and it's one thing if I went and put up a bunch of signs saying, we're gonna have a meeting at 7 o'clock tonight, and well, we wouldn't do that now, it would be a virtual meeting, but we're gonna have a meeting and you can come if you want, you know, it's got to be a little bit more than that. So you have to actively go and talk to the people who are going to be impacted by whether it's a dam going up on a river or a new construction or anything that's going to impact the neighborhood that they live in. So that's a responsibility of the people who are going to be doing that work, but it's also a real opportunity because the people who live in the neighborhood are the people who know about the neighborhood. And they know way more than anybody else who might be coming in with, could be some really great ideas, but if you don't live in a place, it's really hard to know all of the little facets of what goes on there and what's important to the people who are there.
We actually, Melissa, oh, sorry, Melissa, we got a good question from the last iteration of questions that came in a little bit later that I think actually speaks to what you're saying right now too. The participant asked, how do you know that the mitigation you do today doesn't harm another area, which I think could also be an issue of environmental justice too, because if you are putting a dam up in one area to keep the water away from, you know, your property, that, you know, how does that impact, you know, other neighborhoods that may not have the resources to build a dam?
Yeah, I think that's a really thoughtful question. And you know, I think sometimes, honestly, maybe you can't anticipate some impacts, but luckily, I think with, you know, more knowledge, more case studies about what's happened in other places and modeling software and things like that, we can do a better job now of anticipating some of those things that maybe before we weren't able to. But yeah, I think just the fact that this person asked that question that's what we're hoping for, right? That all the people who are working on projects like this would ask a question like that and just be like, man, how do I know that this isn't going to be bad 10 years from now, or it might harm the people who live in a different community? So just asking that question, I think, is one of the steps in the right direction. Yeah. Okay. Here's an example. So this is a community meeting. And that's one good way to get people together and show them what is being thought about, ask them good questions. But it's really about getting the people who live in a neighborhood engaged in what might be implemented there. So now we're getting into a little bit more of the fun part, I think, which is big brainstorming about what could it be like if we're trying to build in some of this resilience. So the museum is thinking about lots of different things, and these are good inspiration photos for us, and hopefully they'll be good inspiration photos for you too. So the upper right picture with the green area is from East Boston, and I put that there because it looks a lot different than the current museum boardwalk, which is basically there's boards of wood and then it drops off and then there's the water. So if you have a lot of green space like you see here that's butting up against the water, then when there's flooding, the green space and the soil and the plants actually can absorb literally absorb some of that water, and then it's easier to have that green space bounce back and be resilient. So that's a natural solution, right? That's probably how the edge of the water there was, you know, many, many years ago before we built any buildings there. So it's kind of that idea of returning. Nature often has the solution, and maybe returning to something that's a little more natural kind of is going to help us solve that problem anyway. So that's one sort of approach to this. The one on the far left is like a fence that you can put up, a flooding fence. So it's something that can get put up. It's kind of like a short-term wall that would help block water, and then you would take it down when the flooding is gone. So it's definitely not natural, and it's definitely not permanent, but it is one way that you can do something like that. The picture at the bottom is also kind of like a wall, but it's a little more friendly maybe. It's some steps that you could sit on or walk on, but basically it is building up height so that the water, you know, if the water is flooding and coming up higher, that it wouldn't come into the museum. So that's another approach that you could take. Then there's also some just really cool, fun stuff that you can do. So, you know, whatever we do for the design of the new waterfront in front of the museum, one of the things that we want to make sure is that families have fun there and they can engage and kind of learn about nature and maybe build some of those types of memories like you guys shared at the beginning, things that are meaningful. So we have some cool floating islands on the picture on the left there. How awesome would that be if you could like take your own little boat with your family out to a tiny little island and see the flowers there and kind of experiment and observe what's going on. And then the picture on the right is a water hammock. So sorry, my phone is ringing. The boardwalk area, like you can imagine if you kind of cut a hole in it and had a hammock, so you could actually sit in the hammock and look right down into the water. That could be kind of fun. And then just a couple more images. The one on the upper left is Chicago. They built some of those water steps that I kind of showed earlier. So they built up there the edge of the water to protect from flooding. And then more of a natural area on the right that again would kind of help absorb some water. So there's lots of, I mean, there's so many possibilities and cool ways that you could redesign. And hopefully in doing that, if you're talking to the right people and talking to the people in the neighborhood, it actually could bring out a lot of people to enjoy that space in a way that is even better than what's there currently. So that would be one of our goals for sure. Okay. So this was the challenge, one of the challenges that we are sharing with you today. And maybe we can talk through it, but should I pause and see, Kellyanne, if there are any other questions that have popped up with the inspiration images that I just showed?
There haven't been any new questions. Someone had asked earlier about a specific protocol that you have to follow when it floods. And then someone also asked about, do you see a lot of fish because of the flooding? So there is a lot of fascination around the topic of flooding.
Yeah, I mean, so yeah, I mean, sometimes, occasionally you do see some fish that get washed up. Also, as we circling way back to what happened at the beginning of the call, we have a lot of seagulls around there too. So sometimes they could be part of the reason there are fish on the boardwalk.
Yeah.
And then,
especially if there are French fries there too.
Yeah. And the question about the protocol was like, how does the museum actually handle the flooding? Was that?
I think it was just, is there a specific, like, are you restricted in any way when it floods, or probably you have to find another way to get into the museum?
Yep, yeah, and I mean, for the storm in 2018 when the loading dock was really flooded, then the museum closed that day and nobody reported to work. They definitely have sandbags and things that they put out to block doorways, like so they'll try and keep the water from going in under the doors and things like that. If we didn't design in a more kind of resilient natural area in front of the museum, then I think we would probably eventually need to invest in like the flooding fencing kind of system. But we don't have that right now, and luckily there hasn't been a flood so bad that we really would have needed those. But I think our tendency is to want to do something a little more natural than that, and hopefully we'll be able to do that once we go through our whole process and talk to everybody and figure out what really will work. So.
You also got a nice comment about, and speaking of nature, my dog just broke through the gate that she was being trapped by, so if she chimes in, sorry about that. Someone said you can use the history of the land, even back to the glacial ages, to help determine what would help. And this includes how the water flows in the area.
Yeah, exactly. That is so spot on. That, looking back to what it was like a long time ago in that land before we built anything, and then how nature sort of moves through that area. What is the water flow like? And how we changed the channel even over time. Humans changed the channel over time so that the water flow is different. And do we want to try and go back to something that's a little more natural, like it would have been 100 years ago? Yeah, those are all really good thoughts.
And then just someone made a comment about the environmental justice issue to add that it also references the fact that some neighborhoods have more dirty industries than others, so incinerators, power plants, etc., that can be harmful to humans.
Yeah. And that actually, so with this challenge that we're putting forward, that could be an approach that you want to take if you choose to engage with this challenge. So we're suggesting that you would think about environmental justice in your neighborhood or community. So maybe flooding isn't really an issue where you are right now, but maybe there is, some sort of factory that you think maybe is an issue around environmental justice, and what could you do to help make it a cleaner neighborhood by working with the factory or implementing some solutions there. So it could be a bunch of different things. Mm-hmm.
Someone is also suggesting thinking about innovations. So clearly we do need to have, power in some way in our communities. Maybe we could also think of other ways of generating that power that's cleaner. So someone said, make more windmills. And someone asked, why can't they just build up the land? Melissa, do you understand that question?
Well, I wonder if they mean build up the edge of the land so that it was more like a wall. Yeah. So that definitely is a possibility, and it's something that we are considering, at least in some areas in front of the museum, that we could just build it up through hopefully less of a wall, more of like cool seating area or something like that would be kind of friendly to families and people walking through that area. But that is definitely an option. Yeah. So the last slide, other than the challenge, which we're asking you guys to think about, and I know Thompson Island is going to talk after this, and they have another challenge that you could consider, but I did just want to share the website where the recordings are. So if you go to the Boston Children's Museum website, and it's /Future of Construction, you can see the webinars from earlier in the week, and then this one will go up and tomorrow. And then we also have a way that if you do engage in one of the challenges, either the one that we just talked about around environmental justice or the next one that we'll present in a minute, you can work with your teacher or your caregiver to submit something that you draw or model on the computer or whatever you create for your solution, because we would love to see them, and then we would put them on that same Boston Children's Museum website, so you could have we can have a gallery of what everybody is thinking about. I will also try and maybe I can put a link to the submission form right on that website. That would be smart, because then it's all in one spot. So I'll work on that too.
Melissa, could you also put the link to the put the links in the chat, because you can chat out to everyone once Thompson is presenting? I think that would be
Yep,
helpful.
I will do that.
Thank you.
Super.
And people are already coming up with ideas, so this is a good challenge. So people are saying
Cool.
tidal power generators. The tide can moves the generator that could be located under the boardwalk. So also just thinking about ways that in trying to solve a problem and mitigate it, you're not causing problems for other communities.
Awesome. I'm gonna give my screen back so that you guys can take over and I can see you now.
Thank you, Melissa. Awesome job.
Thanks.
Right, so next up is Chaya and Jay from Thompson Island Outward Bound. Yay.
Thanks, Melissa and Kelly, and really excited to be here. My name is Chaya. I work with curriculum at Thompson Island Outward Bound, specifically with our middle schoolers in one of those programs. And environmental justice is really important to me. Last night I was at Pope John Paul Park in Dorchester walking around, and I was thinking about having the Harbor Walk connect all the way to the area around the Neponset River. And we love to share about food at Outward Bound and talk about food as much as we can. So my favorite food is pizza.
Hi, my name is Jay, and I'm the Island Programs Manager out on Thompson Island. And I too share real passion around climate justice and its connections to social justice. And I've worked for a long time doing what I can to help both mitigate and problem solve a little bit. And particularly working on an island, we're thinking about this a lot. And some of the modeling that Melissa shared with you impacts us. And we've seen models where within 50 years, our island becomes first 2 islands, then 4 islands, and then continue until, there are some models that show certain amounts of sea level rise that get us to, we're a little archipelago out there instead of a single former drumlin. But my favorite food, it's got to be barbecue. All right. Although if I'm being really climate friendly, I've got to counteract it with weeks of veganism too.
All right, so we're going to continue to use the Q&A feature if you have any questions for us, and let's use our raise your hand feature. Who's been to Thompson Island before? Raise your hand if you've been out to Thompson Island. Got a couple hands going up, 7. All right, so we're going to do a quick overview of the island for folks who haven't been to Thompson Island before. And a huge shout out to students at the King and Mr. Kovach and Miss Lee's class. They already identified some challenges for us to think about and to talk about today, since they are Thompson Island experts. So we're going to kind of combine those ideas and get an overview as well as focus in on some of those challenges. So Thompson Island is part of Boston Harbor, and it's also part of the National Park System. It's about 170 acres at high tide, and it expands all the way down up to like 204 acres at low tide, since you can walk on more of the area. And it was formed by movement from the glaciers. So you already have these great segues. Someone mentioned the glaciers earlier. So it's formed from glacial debris, like all the islands in the harbor. And of course, the first people who were there are the indigenous people who used it as a fishing outpost and a stop when they were fishing around the harbor. And then the first school was formed on the island in 1833. It was a farming school for boys, which had different iterations throughout the years. They eventually opened up the school to all students and had lots of different educational programming throughout the years. And now we have 3 main programs for students or for young people. So we have our Expeditions program, we have our Connections program, and we have our Green Ambassadors program. So we work mostly with middle schoolers and high schoolers, and we could do all kinds of different activities on the island. So we have kayaking, we have backpacking, we have high and low ropes courses, we have hands-on science lessons. You can visit the salt marsh and look at some of the organisms there, learn about some of the insects on island, and thinking about the micro-wilderness. And it's really a place for you to explore, learn more about science and nature. When we have a connection to these spaces, we care more about them, and we're able to design better for the future, and also where you can learn more about yourself too. So we have some challenges that the King students identified that Jay and I categorized into kind of 4 main areas. So we're going to talk about the accessibility of the island, mainly getting there on the ferry. We're going to talk about our food, waste, trash, and recycling systems a bit. We're going to talk about electricity on the island and how we're using cleaner energy sources. And then we're going to talk about some of the annoying things like mosquitoes and just some of those general annoyances that you may have experienced on island.
Thanks, Chaya, and thanks, King students, for submitting those. So it seems like most of the people here have not yet visited the island, and so it's worth explaining that we have our own ferry that goes from EDIC Pier in the Seaport District out to Thompson Island in the summertime. In a normal year when lots of programs are running, that boat goes back and forth multiple times a day. It takes about 25 minutes, maybe a little less on a really calm day without waves and wind. And we go out, it's on the motor vessel Outward Bound. This is a steel-hulled ship that carries about 132 people. It has two big fuel tanks on either side of the hull, and each of those tanks holds 825 gallons of diesel fuel. All right. So if you know a little bit about fossil fuel and internal combustion engines, diesel fuel is a little safer. It is less flammable. It's heavier, and you can get some better fuel efficiency, and in automobiles, better mileage, often using diesel. But the emissions are dirtier, and so there's more carbon in the exhaust in that. So our boat burns again, weather depending and conditions depending, between 10 and 15 gallons of diesel fuel an hour. All right. So in addition to ferrying people back and forth, it's really important to know that in any island community or anyone that's not connected to the mainland by some sort of a causeway, boats bring all the supplies, always. And it's not just islands in Boston Harbor, but around the world where we've got island nations or island communities off the coast of lots of our New England states. So that means that all sorts of, all our food, all our building supplies, all the materials we use for the educational programs we run come out to us on that ferry. And so that means that this boat is designed not just to carry 132 people, but also 10 tons of cargo in addition to people, which is somewhere between 2 and 3 elephants that we can get on there in addition to full human capacity, if we were going to load it full up with 10 tons. All right. So the boat itself, again, I mentioned it's a steel hull. The boat itself, empty, weighs 120,000 pounds, so 60 to 65 tons, empty vessel. So this is a heavy ship. It requires a pretty massive engine to power her. And as I said, it burns diesel. So a little bit of good news and bad news with the diesel. Interestingly, if we think about using boats to come out and back and forth from the island, in this technology, as with so many that we use today that contribute to climate change, the cleaner modes of transportation and the cleaner technologies were the ones that were getting used 150 years ago. So obviously, instead of burning diesel that emits carbon in its exhaust, sailing ships or rowing vessels that had to row were a lot more energy efficient and cleaner energy using, whether through human or wind. So we're stuck with what we got for now because of our needs. We can't afford to be rowing. We can't afford the staff to row. We need a ship that can travel every day of the year in all conditions. So a still windless day doesn't work for us. So we use this diesel engine, and ideally the efficiency of diesel engines, the emissions of engines are improving, and we will need to upgrade at some point to be more climate and planet conscious about this. All right. Are there questions about the boat before I move on to other things? I see a few. Let me just look. It looks like our people, it looks like Kellyanne and Melissa may have taken off. Let me see if I can find the questions.
I'm here. I just
Oh,
wasn't
you
sure
got
if
it.
I was doing the questions.
Is it an actual, so I see a question that is Thompson Island an actual island? And somebody's saying, yes, Green Corps, that's great. We used to do Green Corps. Green Ambassadors has grown out of Green Corps. Somebody, I suspect that whoever asked the question, is it an actual island, may know that at low tide, we are connected to Quincy. There's a sand spit that when the tide, really from about mid-tide down, for about 5 hours at the bottom half of the tide, you can walk to Quincy and barely get your feet wet. So we're still an island because at high tide we are fully isolated, but whoever asked that is right that part of the day we're not.
Someone was asking, are there sensors on the boat?
Sensors for what purpose?
I'm kind of wondering if they're thinking back to our lesson on robotics, and I think they might be trying to figure out if the boat is a robot, but I'm not sure.
No, that's interesting. And when we talk about efficiencies, certainly in the automobile industry, we're hearing more and more about driverless vehicles. And so far, I haven't heard that applying to marine vessels, but I'm sure people are thinking and having those conversations. And I'm sure engineering has begun. There's a ton that's already happening that is computerized, mostly on massive shipping container vessels and other giant ships. Certainly naval ships use a lot of computers and reduce the need for human decision making and human action. But right now we've got some captains and deckhands who still do most of the work.
Someone else, the person had added that they were thinking about the idea of making it autonomous. So thank you for that. And then also the engine, someone is asking about what type of engine is there on the boat.
Yeah, it's a good question. We've got I don't know the brand. I think it's a Detroit diesel engine. This boat was built specifically for us in the early 1990s. So this is the same engine that's been in this boat since 1995. And one of the reasons we stick with the diesel engine, in spite of the downsides that we've discussed, is this particular engine is incredibly reliable and it has very few mechanical problems. And the other thing is when it does, it's a simple engine. And it has fewer moving parts than lots of more modern engines. It's easier to repair. Most of the time, our own captains and folks who work with us can repair it rather than having to ship it up to Gloucester or elsewhere to get others to maintain it.
Also,
does that help answer?
I think so. And then someone from the McKay School just said that they were very glad that they got to go to the Thompson Island prior to this whole situation.
Yeah, we are too. We'll open up as soon as we can. And we got people out living on the island. Just saw photos yesterday. It looks the way it always does, maintained, and the leaves are raked and the trees are blooming. And as soon as we get the green light, we'll be back out there.
And then also just one more question about the fuel. So how much fuel does the ship use per day?
So again, it depends on the time of year. In the wintertime, when we're not running programs, it's only one trip back and forth from the city each day. And so if it's burning 10 to 15 gallons per hour, it would only burn 10 or 15 gallons on those days. So that means each one direction burns 6 gallons of fuel, say, okay? As I said, in the summertime, we've got lots of programs. We have events. People come and get married out there. People do all sorts of different things on the island, and the boat's going back and forth all day. So on those days, you might burn 75 gallons of fuel in a day, which is a lot. So I want to move on because I'm aware of our time a little bit. The other thing, so one of the things I wanted to say is island communities usually are really efficient because it's hard to get things out to islands and it's hard to get things off islands. And so you try and use as much and be as efficient as you can with the things that come out. We try to be this way, and I'm pleased to say that a lot of the efficiencies that we have implemented and are implementing come from young people and come from our program participants who are really thoughtful and who ask great questions. And one of the things we've been really working on the last few years is how we manage our trash and food waste. And Green Ambassadors, who are 15 to 18-year-old Boston public school kids, for the last several summers have been pushing for us to do better and throw less away. And so a few summers ago, we implemented recycling, and it's single stream recycling. It's in our dining hall, it's at our event sites, and it's in our staff and student dormitories. So that's only within the last few years we've been doing that. In the last year, again, Green Ambassadors began building composting bins. And so now we separate out food waste in the dining hall and at event spaces and in staff dormitories as well. And those first go into local nearby recycling bins, then they get hauled down to our garden. And this will be the first summer where we are using mostly composting and soils from right on island to grow vegetables that we can serve in our staff dorms and in our dining hall. All right. If there aren't questions about that, I think I better turn it back over to Chaya.
All right, we'll keep going talking about the energy systems in the dorms. So electricity is our biggest use of energy in the dorms. And if you've been to the island before, you may have stayed over in the dorms and you may have complained that it's cold. Well, even when we turn up the heat, which is powered by electricity all the way, it still could be kind of drafty. You see that the buildings have been there for almost 100 years. So the electricity that takes up a lot of energy on island, we're working on making it more efficient. Some ways that we're doing that are replacing a lot of the bulbs. We've switched to LED bulbs, I think throughout the whole island. And we've also installed some sensors and photo cell lighting that comes on at night to make the island safer, and then it goes off automatically during the day, which is helping save a lot of wattage and in turn saving a lot of money as well. You'll also notice a big difference in the temperature between like September and October moving into November, and then from April to May. So during the winter months, we try to really conserve our heat and keep those costs down and keep the use of energy down too. We've also worked on replacing a lot of the windows, and we're working on replacing the ones that we haven't yet, and replacing and adding to the seals around some of the entranceways like the doors. And we've also checked out and have considered solar panels throughout the past. So putting them on one of the buildings behind Sakowich. And policies are changing with those solar panels, which are making them more accessible and their energy more efficient as well. So we're considering them on an ongoing basis and hoping to get even like updated estimates that we'd be able to have some solar panels on island and move away from electricity. And in your own homes, in your own neighborhoods, you may have heard of the organization called Mass Saves. We've worked with them on island to help consider more efficient energy systems. And they also work with residents too. So they might help you replace your fridge or help you replace your lights or help you with your heating system. And they have some resources for teachers and students too. So when we're thinking about our food waste, trash systems, and our electricity, it's important to know that we're making some small changes, but overall they can have a really big impact, just like we're doing at home. Kellyanne, do you have any questions about the dorms or electricity? And thank you, Kellyanne, for checking the Q&A for us.
Oh, no worries. So yeah, just someone commented that solar energy solar energy and better insulation are great. Also thinking about geothermal plants. But no questions so far.
All right, we have a few more minutes. So some of our annoyances that King students brought up were the kind of pests on island, like the mosquitoes and the deer ticks, and of course the water main, if you've gone through Watergate last year. So we have deer that live in Boston Harbor, and I had no idea that deer were amazing swimmers. So they swim around from the different islands and from the mainland and enjoy the vegetation. Right now they're enjoying the freedom and not having a lot of people around. And with the deer, they bring ticks, which can carry diseases and lodge into our bodies. You may have heard about them and being aware of ticks when you're outside. So that's one of our annoyances that we face on island. And right now, we don't have a really strong system of how to mitigate the ticks. We do have providers that come in and spray the areas, especially the most common areas where we have the majority of people, and also where we know the hatching areas are for the ticks, like where fresh water might be standing. When you first arrive to Thompson Island around the waterfront building, there's some freshwater areas around there, common places for ticks to hatch. So we make sure that we keep those areas sprayed, and then also keeping the grass at a very low level. So our island staff, even right now, are out there keeping the grass cut, which provides less breeding ground for the ticks. So keeping the areas freshly mowed is really important. But that would be a really interesting way to, a really interesting challenge or model to design a solution for that blends in with the ecosystem, takes care of the deer, and also protects us from the ticks. And then another annoyance that we mentioned was the water main. So you see a picture here of how the water main is being replaced, and Jay's going to talk a bit more about that.
Yeah, I will. Before I talk about that, I'd just say these are really good questions, and a lot of this, our problem solving relates to a question somebody asked earlier when Melissa was presenting about whether or not you know if your solutions are actually causing other problems. And so we have to be really conscious about that out on the island too, especially when it comes to spraying and pesticides and insecticides and things. We're in a national park. We really value the natural resources and land and space out there, and we got to be really careful not to disrupt our local ecosystem and have unintended negative consequences as we're problem solving. So somebody else said, and this gets us back to the water main that's coming across the sand spit that connects us to Quincy. Somebody said, why don't you walk when you can at low tide? Instead of taking the boat, why don't you ship things across the spit, which is a really good idea. I think part of the issue there, and it wouldn't be 100% of the time, but sometimes getting the people who deliver our food and materials for them to drive to Quincy in order to cross there would be burning more fuel too, and perhaps even more than the boat would. So I'm going to investigate that though, because I like that creative thinking.
I love the idea of the Star Wars all-terrain walking around.
I do
It's a very
too.
beautiful visual.
It might have the positive unintended consequence of scaring those deer off and bringing the ticks with them.
We could also point out that this looks like it's really solid. It's not all solid. So almost it's a 50-50. If you were to go to the spit, you could see people stuck in this silt around here. So very easily you could take one step and sink down to your thigh, sink down to your waist. So even though it looks like it's solid, hard-packed sand to walk across, in many places it's not. So that's one reason why we do not walk across the spit, and why it could be difficult getting things back and forth across the spit.
Yeah, that's true, Chaya. And there are moments in the tide where the water's really whipping over that thing, and the currents are dangerous, and we don't let our staff do it, and just because it's a safety problem over there.
Chaya and Jay, just to be mindful of time, we're at 2:00 right now. I'm happy to stay on. There's actually been more great questions, so I'm glad to stay on. I don't know if I can answer them, so Jay and Chaya, if you want to stay on too, that would be cool.
Sure, and I'll move ahead to the design challenge, so students can have that in mind if they do have to go.
Thank you, Chaya.
Of course. So in addition to the one that Melissa shared, there's also another option where you can create a model that shows how you would solve one of the problems that we're facing on Thompson Island. And we gave just a brief overview of some of our main ones, but you may have your own experience with a problem that you faced on Thompson Island. So I really think creatively, and it's whatever works for you, and how you could address that problem with images, words, a 3D model, or physical model. And tomorrow, Kellyanne's going to show you a big highlight. Really excited for this part of the project, using some software called Tinkercad. So that will be tomorrow at 1 o'clock with Kellyanne. And then our cool down activity is just which design challenge are you thinking about? Which one is on your mind right now? And Jay and I will stay on with Kellyanne and answer any other questions that you may have.
Thank you, Jay and Chaya. That was awesome. You're making me want to go back to Thompson Island. So
Thank you.
happy and sad. Trying to see if there's other. So there was a question about back to Chaya's, and these actually are great questions. Tomorrow we're going to be talking about design thinking, and one of the first steps, or actually the first step in design thinking, is to interview people who are experiencing the problem. And I would say that Jay and Chaya spend a lot of time on the island, so they're really great people to actually ask questions too about, some of the pain points that they have or some of the challenges that they face. One question someone asked is, how likely is it for someone to get Lyme disease from the ticks?
That's a really good question. Up till very recently, it was very unlikely because most of the ticks on Thompson Island were dog ticks, which aren't typically carriers of Lyme and some of the other vector-borne illnesses that the ticks carry. We are unhappy that there are deer on the island, and we've talked about ways to chase them off and scare them off, and we are inhibited by some of the national park regulations and policies, and so the deer remain with us, and they carry the deer ticks, and the deer ticks are more likely to have Lyme disease and other diseases. So this concerns us a lot. We're doing a lot of mitigation that doesn't involve deer eradication. And so I go out there, lots of us who spend our days out there, dip all our clothing in permethrin, spray permethrin on our shoes, tuck pant cuffs into socks, wear light colored clothing so we can see ticks if they're on us. We often, instead of sitting directly in our group circles on the ground, we'll try to pick a spot where we're off the ground, or maybe put a tarp down or something like that. So we're thinking about ways to either see ticks on us, repel them with reasonably safe chemicals, and be just really mindful about avoiding the likeliest ways to come into contact with them.
Someone also asked, are there birds or other animals there already on the island that would help destroy ticks and mosquitoes?
Yeah, that's another great question. And I confess, I don't know that there are birds who actively hunt and eat ticks. I know guinea hens, guinea fowl do that. We don't have those out on the island. We do have a lot of wild turkeys. I see them feeding and scratching a lot. I know they do other types of insects and grubs that they dig up and eat off the ground. But I don't know. That's a research. I'll have to investigate that and get back to this group. Do the wild turkeys eat ticks? I hope so.
Someone is suggesting designing robots that will scare the predators or scare the deer away. Interesting. Thinking about that Boston Dynamic robot that they're using in Singapore to remind people about social distancing.
Yeah, people talk about, ultrasonic signals that, high-pitched frequencies that bother the deer and don't bother the rest of us. But again, unintended consequences, we worry about those sorts of mitigation efforts because they may send other species that we like having around away with the deer.
So no
But
robot wolves on the island?
Yeah. We have coyotes on the island too, and we were actually kind of hoping that there'd be a natural process that would discourage deer inhabitation on the island, that the coyotes would do our work for us. But so far that hasn't really happened. But in food chains, the balances shift seasonally and annually. So we may get rid of them, at least temporarily, if we get a bigger coyote population.
And for those of you students who are here who need to hop off, you may, but we're just sticking around to answer any questions that you have. I'm trying to see if there are other questions. Oh, are there more animals and insects on the island now that people are quarantined?
Jaya?
Yeah, we have a couple people still out on island, living on island, and we also have a couple night cameras set up around island, and we've been seeing more animals, an influx of the deer, some foxes, lots of birds. You probably even noticed in your own neighborhood, birds are everywhere, and they're definitely just thriving and singing, and the migratory birds are coming back and starting to hatch as well. So we've seen an influx of animals, and we think that they're really kind of expanding the areas that they frequent, since there aren't a lot of people around to keep them out of those places.
Any other questions, or does anyone want to tell us what design challenge you're thinking about, or have questions about getting started? I do agree that this was an awesome session.
Oh, great.
Would there actually be a way, I was actually thinking about this, Chaya and Jay, because I think it will be helpful for the students to have access to the problems that you presented. We should try to figure out ways that we can, maybe it's through the Children's Museum. I don't know if Melissa's still here, to maybe post this presentation or parts of the presentation so students can and teachers can refer to it if they're working on the design challenge. Melissa, you're there.
Yeah, if you guys wanted to share like a PDF of your slides, we could post that, or really whatever is easiest for you, but we could definitely do that.
Sounds
I
good.
think-
I'll definitely share it with both of you. And here's Jay and I's email. If you have any questions about like the specifics here, more about the ferry or cost or anything like that, we're happy to answer them. A lot of the ferry information was new for me, and I just found it really, really interesting and fascinating. So please reach out to us if you have more questions.
Absolutely. Thanks for joining.
Yep.
And for inviting us.
Well, it was awesome to have both of the groups here for this session. Again, tomorrow we're going to be extending this and thinking about Tinkercad, thinking about how we can use nature as a design partner, similar to how architects and designers sometimes use the concept of biomimicry, which is something that we're going to be talking about. So learning from nature in order to build things that are more efficient. Nature's been building things that are efficient for millennia or more. So very excited about that tomorrow. If there are no more questions, some people are saying goodbye. There seem to be some birthdays, so happy birthday everyone whose birthday it is today. And we will see you tomorrow. So same time, same place. Might have a different Tinkercad shirt on tomorrow. I'm thinking purple tomorrow. But we will see you tomorrow, 1 o'clock. Please take care in the meantime. And thank you again to Chaya, to Jay, and to Melissa for helping us think through these design challenges. So great job, everyone. Take care. Signing off. Bye.
Thank you, Kellyanne.
Bye, everyone. Thanks, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.